Menaces set the books down the way he set everything down after a long voyage, without ceremony, without announcement, with the slightly distracted relief of a man whose hands had been full for too long. The cloth came first, then the oil, then a small bundle of correspondence wrapped in leather, and then, almost as an afterthought, the scrolls. 3 of them, thin and tightly wound, smelling of the ship and the sea, and whatever room in Athens they had come from before that. He had picked them up from a bookseller near the agora, the way another merchant might have picked up a handful of small coins, simply because they were there, and because the weight of them was nothing. His son Zeno was perhaps 15, perhaps a little older. The sources that survive are not precise about his age on any particular day. What they record is that the books were there, and that Zeno saw them, and that this was not the first time. His father made this journey regularly, south from Citium, across the open water, into the harbor at Piraeus, then the short road into Athens. He went for trade, and he returned with trade goods, and among those goods, now and then, were texts, books about Socrates, books reporting what Socrates had said, or what people who knew him had remembered him saying, or what it had been like to sit near him in the public spaces of Athens, while he asked his slow, destabilizing questions about justice and virtue and the nature of a well-lived life. Menaces was a merchant, not a philosopher, but he had learned to carry the text the way he carried anything else worth transporting across the Mediterranean, carefully, with an understanding that some things hold their value better than others over a long journey. Citium was a city that held 2 worlds without forcing them to choose between themselves. On its streets, Phoenician and Greek had been spoken side by side for generations, and the harbor carried vessels from both traditions. The temples reflected both inheritances. The names people gave their children reflected both. Zeno grew up in a house where this doubleness was simply the texture of daily life. Not a problem, not a tension requiring resolution, just the shape of the place where he happened to have been born. Cyprus had that quality. It sat in the water between worlds, close enough to the Levantine coast to carry Phoenician blood in its oldest families, Greek enough in its civic and intellectual culture to feel the constant pull of Athens, the city that seemed, from a certain distance, to be the place where every serious question eventually found its way. The books his father brought back were part of that pull. They arrived in the house as physical objects first, dense, slightly fragrant, difficult to unroll without practice, and then slowly as something else. Zeno had been given the right kind of attention for text to take hold. Whatever instinct his father's regular voyages had planted in him, the sense that ideas were among the things worth bringing back from far places, had settled into a genuine orientation. He read the Socratic accounts, not the way a student reads an assigned text, moving through it dutifully toward the end, but the way someone reads who has already, without knowing it, been waiting for the thing being described. Socrates in those texts was not an abstraction. He was a person. He walked barefoot through the streets of Athens in all weathers. He stopped people he knew and people he did not know and asked them questions they had not expected to be asked. He was ugly, by ancient account, snub-nosed, broad-faced, stocky in a way that sat at odds with the Greek ideal of bodily beauty. And yet, people followed him, or at least lingered near him, because something about the quality of his attention made the questions he asked feel urgent in a way that questions about trade or weather or civic affairs did not. He wanted to know what virtue actually was, not as a general topic, not as a rhetorical exercise, but as a genuine and practical matter. Because if a person did not know what virtue was, how could they be confident they were pursuing it rather than merely pursuing its appearance. And the pursuit of an appearance, Socrates seemed to hold, was one of the ways a life went most thoroughly wrong. Zeno read this in Citium. He read it in a house where his father's trade goods sat alongside his father's books, the commercial and the intellectual arriving from the same port on the same ships. He was learning, without yet having a name for what he was learning, that the world of ideas and the world of goods moved through the same channels, touched the same hands, required the same willingness to travel. He was also learning something about Socrates specifically, something about the shape of a life devoted entirely to asking what a life ought to be devoted to. It was not a comfortable shape. Socrates had made enemies. He had been tried and convicted and had drunk hemlock in a small stone room while his friends watched. And yet the texts that described this did not read like accounts of a defeated man. They read like accounts of someone who had worked out, in considerable practical detail, what could not be taken from a person, no matter what was taken from them. This was a distinction Zeno had not yet had occasion to test. He was young, and Citium was not Athens, and his father was alive, and the business was intact, and the future, insofar as the future ever looks like anything from inside the present, probably looked like more of what already was. More voyages, more goods arriving and departing, more books perhaps among the cargo. The sea that connected Citium to Athens was not, in the ancient eastern Mediterranean, something a person thought of as dangerous in the abstract. It was a practical passage, traversed constantly by merchants and travelers, and envoys and scholars, subject to the ordinary mathematics of risk that any person who made a living from long-distance trade learned to calculate without drama. Storms happened, ships were lost. These were facts folded into the cost of doing business, acknowledged in the way that anyone who works close to large natural forces acknowledges what those forces are capable of, without letting the acknowledgement become paralysis. Manassa had made the journey many times. Zeno had made it too, by the time the event the ancient sources described took place, in circumstances those sources record with characteristic imprecision. A ship, a cargo of purple dye, some accounts say, though others mention grain, and the discrepancy matters less than the agreement on what happened to it. The eastern Mediterranean, somewhere between Cyprus and the Greek mainland. A storm, or the aftermath of a storm, or the particular concatenation of wind and current and timing that the sea produces when it is not interested in the plans of the people on its surface. The ship went down, the cargo went with it. The man who had been a merchant arrived in Athens with nothing that commerce could use. His livelihood at the bottom of the water, his social position, the status that derived from his function as a trader, from the goods he carried, and the relationships those goods maintained, dissolved as thoroughly as anything else the sea had taken. The ancient sources treat this moment with a certain interpretive satisfaction. They cannot resist the mythological aptness of it. The young man from Cyprus loses everything material and finds in the aftermath of that loss the philosophical life he was perhaps always moving toward. There is something in the biographical tradition that wants the shipwreck to mean something, to serve as an omen or a divine redirection, the universe arranging a curriculum for a student who had not yet known he needed one. Later, after Stoicism had developed its doctrines and found its language, the story would carry additional weight, because what the shipwreck had enacted in Zeno's life was precisely what Stoic philosophy would go on to argue in its most systematic form, that the things fortune can take from a person are, in some fundamental sense, not truly that person's own. The cargo was cargo. Its loss was real, but the capacity to reason, to examine, to ask what was genuinely good, That was something the water could not reach. But this is to run ahead of the story. In the immediate aftermath, there was no doctrine. There was only a man in a city he had been to before, probably, or at least a city his father had described, now standing in it with different resources than he had arrived with previously, and no commercial reason to be there. Athens in this period was the kind of place that absorbed people who arrived at its edges without a clear plan. It was large enough for a stranger to lose himself in, active enough to make idleness feel natural. There was always something happening in the agora, always some exchange of goods or words, or civic business to stand near while deciding what to do next. The agora itself was the center of Athenian public life in the way that nothing in Citium quite prepared a visitor for. It was not simply a marketplace, though it was that, stalls and vendors, and the constant negotiation of prices and qualities and quantities that any commercial space produces. It was also the site of civic administration, of informal legal proceedings, of religious observance, of the kind of casual philosophical debate that the Athenians had developed into something approaching a civic art form. People argued in the agora. They argued about prices and about ideas, about the quality of olives and about the nature of justice, and the line between these two categories of dispute was sometimes thinner than it appeared. The city had a habit of taking arguments seriously, not in the formal, institutional sense, though those institutions existed, but in the daily, walking through the square sense. In Athens, a person could find someone willing to discuss almost anything, at almost any level of depth, simply by standing in the right place and being visibly available for the conversation. The bookseller's stall was in or near the agora. Ancient Athens had these, small establishments where scrolls could be bought or copied, or simply handled, where a person with literary interests could spend an afternoon among texts without making any particular commitment to purchase. The stall where Zeno stopped was not by any account a remarkable place. It was the kind of ordinary commercial space that a city like Athens produces in sufficient quantity that no one records their names or their precise locations. What made this one matter was not the stall itself, but what was in it, and more specifically, what Zeno's hand happened to find when he began, with the unhurried attention of someone who has no other immediate obligation, to look through what was available. Xenophon's asterisk memorabilia. Asterisk was there. The book whose name meant something like memorable things or recollections, a collection of accounts of Socratic conversations, of exchanges Xenophon had witnessed or reconstructed from testimony, of scenes depicting Socrates moving through Athens and asking his questions and making his arguments in the direct, unshowy way that Xenophon admired and wanted to preserve. Xenophon was a practical man, a soldier and an administrator, and his portrait of Socrates was the portrait of someone who had found practical wisdom, who had thought carefully about how to live, and had arrived at conclusions that could be applied. The asterisk, memorabilia. Asterisk was not a work of abstract philosophy. It was a book about what a specific person did with philosophy, day after day, in the real world of an actual city, with its real pressures and its real demands. Zeno opened it. The sources do not tell us exactly which passage his attention settled on first, or how long he stood there in the bookseller's stall, reading before he understood what he had found. What they record is the quality of his response, which was immediate and complete enough that he asked the bookseller a question, not about the text, but about the kind of man described in it. Where, he wanted to know, could a person find men like this? Not the historical Socrates, who had been dead for a generation, but men of that kind. men who lived the way Socrates was described as living, men for whom philosophy was not a subject, but a practice, not a set of positions to be argued, but a discipline to be inhabited, daily, in the actual conditions of an actual life. The bookseller pointed. Ancient accounts preserve this gesture without explaining it in detail. A hand extended toward the open square of the agora, a direction indicated. A figure somewhere in that direction, who apparently matched what the bookseller understood the young man to be asking about. The figure was Crates of Thebes. Crates was one of the more visible philosophical presences in the Athens of this period. A cynic philosopher, a student of Diogenes of Sinope, a man who had given away a substantial inherited fortune on the grounds that it was an obstacle to rather than a support for the life he wanted to live. He was recognizable at a distance in the way that people who have made a decisive commitment to a particular mode of life tend to be recognizable at a distance. His clothing was rough, and his movement was unhurried, and his presence in the public spaces of Athens was constant and entirely without the social anxiety that usually accompanied a man of former means making his way through a crowd. Zeno looked up from the scroll he was holding and looked out through the open front of the stall toward where the bookseller was pointing. The city noise was all around him, vendors and citizens, and the low constant hum of a place where thousands of people were managing their daily business simultaneously. Somewhere in that noise, across the open square, a philosopher was walking with the particular unhurried pace of someone who has arranged his life so that hurrying is no longer a relevant concept. The scroll was still in his hands. The words on it, Xenophon's careful transcription of what Socrates had said and done and asked, were still present in his attention. And now, overlaid on that textual image of a philosopher, was a living one, a man who apparently embodied, in the actual flesh of a Wednesday morning in Athens, something close to what those words described. Philosophy as a way of moving through the world. Philosophy as something that showed in a person's gait, in the quality of their attention, in the way they occupied the same agora that everyone else was rushing through on their way to somewhere else. This was different from the books. The books were cargo, extraordinary cargo, cargo worth crossing a sea for, but still something that arrived in a house wrapped and bundled, and requiring the reader to do all the work of translation into life. This was the thing itself, or something closer to the thing itself, walking across open ground under the Athenian morning sky. Zeno had come to Athens without a commercial plan. He had no cargo to sell, no trading relationship to maintain, no appointment with any person whose business connected to his own. He had arrived in the city the way the sea sometimes deposited things, not according to any intention, but with a certain irreversible completeness. He was there. The ship was not. The dye or the grain or whatever it had been was not. And now, standing in a bookseller's stall, in the Athenian agora with a scroll in his hands and a pointing hand directing his attention outward, he had something else entirely. Not a plan, not a commercial future, but a direction, a figure crossing the square, a kind of question he had not known until the moment he read it in the asterisk memorabilia asterisk that he had already been carrying. What Zeno's father had done in bringing those books back from Athens season after season was to create a small private library of philosophical possibility in the back of a merchant's house in Citium. He had not done this with any particular intention, or at least no intention that the sources preserve. He was a trader who liked books, or who recognized their value in some general sense, or who perhaps simply felt that Athens offered things worth bringing home that were not cloth or oil. The books accumulated the way any category of cargo accumulates, When a merchant has a mild affinity for it and encounters it regularly on his routes. They were not chosen as a curriculum. They arrived as part of the ordinary business of connecting one world to another, which was what trade was. But a curriculum is not always chosen. Sometimes it is assembled by circumstances that have no awareness of what they are doing. A father's casual preference, a ship's route that ran through the right ports, a bookseller's stall near a public square, a storm, a scroll about a philosopher who walked barefoot through Athens asking questions that had no easy answers. Each of these things arrived in Zeno's life as a simple fact, unremarkable in itself, pointing toward nothing in particular as it happened. And then they accumulated, and then they pointed. Citium was not a place that philosophy had overlooked. It was a crossroads city, the kind of place where different inheritances coexist without requiring anyone to declare an allegiance. The Phoenician families who had been there for centuries and the Greek culture that had arrived and stayed brought different ways of understanding the world, different accounts of what mattered and what the good life consisted of, different relationships to the gods and to the community and to the individual conscience. A person who grew up in that intersection, who learned to hold two traditions simultaneously without collapsing one into the other, was perhaps already developing a particular kind of attention, the attention of someone who has learned that origin does not determine destination, that a person is not simply the sum of the culture they were born into, that there might be something underneath culture, something that belongs to all of the people who are capable of asking these questions, regardless of which harbor their ships departed from. This was not yet a philosophical doctrine. It was an intuition shaped by the texture of a particular childhood in a particular city. But intuitions of this kind, held long enough and examined with enough honesty, have a way of becoming arguments, os uvifrav arnargarmians, in the hands of someone patient enough to follow them carefully, have a way of becoming schools of thought that outlast everyone who founded them. In Athens, on the morning after the bookseller's stall, or perhaps later the same morning, the sources are not precise about the timing. Zeno was somewhere in the city with a new orientation. He was not yet a philosopher. He had not yet begun to develop the systematic account of virtue and nature and the rational structure of the cosmos that would eventually define his life's work. He was a man from Cyprus who had lost his cargo and found a book about Socrates and been pointed toward a cynic philosopher walking across a crowded public square. These were not large events. They did not feel, in the moment, like the beginning of anything in particular. This is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about the way philosophical lives begin. They do not announce themselves. They do not arrive with the feeling of an origin or the sound of something starting. They arrive as a scroll in a bookseller's stall, as a gesture toward an open square, as the quiet accumulation of one thing after another, until a direction becomes visible that was not visible before. The Socrates that Xenophon had described in the asterisk, memorabilia asterisk, had not walked into philosophy through a marked door. He had walked into it through the streets of Athens, asking questions, receiving unsatisfying answers, returning the next day to ask again. What the text described was not a moment of arrival. It was a practice, patient, daily, unspectacular, devoted. Zeno had read this in Citium, in a house where philosophy arrived bundled with trade goods. He had read it again in Athens, standing in a bookseller's stall, with no commercial reason to be standing anywhere. And now, with the city's noise around him and a pointing hand directing his attention outward, he had one more thing that the book itself could not have given him, a living example, not on papyrus, not in someone else's memory of a man already dead, but there, in the open morning air of the agora, walking with the specific, unhurried quality of a person who has made his peace with the question of what is genuinely worth. Moving quickly, for the scroll was already in his mind by the time he stepped out of the stall into the light. Xenophon's words, Socrates walking barefoot, the questions that had no comfortable answers, all of this was present, gathered in his attention, not as doctrine, but as something more like a destination, whose name he did not yet know. The city stretched around him in every direction, the civic buildings, the temples on the high ground to the south, the vendors and citizens, and the constant lateral movement of a place that was always, simultaneously, doing 1,000 different things. Somewhere in that movement, across the open ground of the agora, a figure was walking at a pace that belonged to a different order of urgency than the one that governed everyone around him. Zeno stepped out of the stall and into the square, following the direction of the bookseller's hand, the city's noise surrounding him on all sides, the morning light falling evenly across the stones, everything unhurried, everything pointing quietly and without drama toward whatever came next. The Athenian agora in the middle of the morning was not a quiet place. Merchants moved between stalls, carrying cloth and oil and dried fish. Magistrates crossed the open square on their way to the stoa of the archons, trailing small groups of men with business to conduct. Citizens stopped one another at the edges of the square, and the talk ran in a dozen directions at once, political and commercial and personal, all of it woven together in the unhurried but persistent way of a city that had been talking to itself for centuries. The noise was not overwhelming, it was full. There is a difference, and anyone who has stood in a large open public space in warm weather understands the distinction instinctively, the fullness that is not oppressive, the sound of human activity that rather than demanding anything, simply indicates that the world is going about its work. On the northern edge of this square, running parallel to the road that passed along that side of the agora, there stood a long colonnaded porch. Its roof ran the length of the structure, carried by columns spaced at regular intervals, and along the back wall, the wall that faced south and caught the morning light, were painted panels of a size and quality that made even people crossing quickly pause and look. The porch opened entirely along its front face. There was no door, no threshold to cross, no boundary between the covered space and the square beyond except the shadow line where the roof's protection began. A person could step in from the agora without making any decision. They could stand half inside and half outside without having committed to either. In the shade of that porch, on a morning when the light outside was already bright enough to make the open square shimmer faintly with warmth, a small group of people had gathered around a man who was walking slowly. He did not stand in one place and speak to them from it. He moved along the length of the porch, unhurried, his voice carrying easily in the sheltered space, and the people listening moved with him or remained where they were and let him come back around again. The columns passed behind him at regular intervals. The painted figures on the back wall scrolled slowly past as he walked, and the sounds of the agora continued just beyond the open edge, not interrupting, not overwhelming, simply present, the way weather is present when you are sitting inside with a window open to it. This was the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch. The name came from the panels on its back wall, works attributed to painters of considerable reputation, among them Polygnotus, Micon, and Pananius, depicting scenes of Athenian military history. The Battle of Marathon was there, the Athenians in the posture of collective courage, frozen at the moment when the outcome had not yet resolved itself, and the choice to hold still required everything. There were other battles, other moments of civic decision, rendered in pigment and fixed in place, watching over the porch from their position on the wall. They did not make the space feel heavy. They made it feel old in the way that certain spaces feel old, not dusty or diminished, but layered, as if the present moment is resting on something that has been here longer than anyone currently in the space. Zeno had been teaching in this porch for years by the time it acquired the second name the ancient world would give it, the Stoic school, named for the Stoa itself, named for the place. Philosophy has been associated with many sites: the grove of a gymnasium, the garden of a private house, the lecture hall of a university, but it is rarer for a school of thought to take its name directly from the architectural structure where it happened. Stoicism remembered, in its own name, the specific kind of building where it began. To stand inside a stoa is to be inside and outside at once. The roof covers you, the wall behind you is solid, but the open colonnade along the front gives you the full width of the world beyond. The square, the street, the comings and goings of the city in all its variety and noise. The wind can reach you, the sun moves across the floor as the day progresses. People passing along the road outside are visible and audible, and they can see, and nothing is sealed, nothing is hidden. The space defines a condition of sheltered presence in the world, a position from which the world's activity can be observed, heard, and participated in, while something overhead and behind you offers a steadiness that the open square cannot quite provide. The man walking along the columns understood this, or perhaps it is better to say that his choice to teach in this porch rather than in a purchased property or a fenced gymnasium on the city's edge expressed something that his teaching would later articulate in words. Architecture can say things that have not yet been said in language. The building was already making an argument before anyone had formulated it as a proposition. The Stoic school did not own the Stoa Poikile. Zeno had not purchased it or arranged exclusive use of it. He had simply begun to teach there in a public building that anyone in the city could enter, and people had begun to come. The contrast with schools that occupied private property, schools whose buildings you would not enter unless you already had some connection to the people inside, was not incidental. The agora was the center of Athenian public life, and a school planted at the center of the agora was a school that had placed itself where the city moved, not watching the city from a studied distance, present in it. On the north side of the square, this was the porch that opened toward the city's daily life. The painted warriors at the Battle of Marathon had held their position in the back panels for decades before Zeno arrived in Athens, and they would hold it for decades more after he was gone. They are worth considering for a moment, not as historical decoration, not merely as the source of the porch's name, but as a presence in the space where a philosophy of inner virtue was taking shape. The soldiers in those panels had not held Marathon through indifference to the outcome. They had held it through something that the people looking at the panels would have understood as courage, the capacity to remain in a difficult position, to do what reason and loyalty demanded, even when the easier thing would have been to withdraw. They were a particular kind of civic image, not triumph, but the moment just before the outcome was known, when the thing required was staying. Against that painted background, a philosopher from Cyprus was talking about the nature of what is genuinely good. He was arguing, carefully and without urgency, that most of what people pursued most intensely, wealth, reputation, comfort, the esteem of their neighbors, did not belong in the same category as virtue. He was suggesting that equanimity was not the abandonment of action, but its proper foundation. And the painted figures behind him, frozen in the posture of men who had decided to hold rather than flee, provided a visual counterpoint that no one in the porch may have consciously registered, but that hung in the space nonetheless, history and ethics sharing the same afternoon shade. The porch stood on the north side of the agora. The American School of Classical Studies, working in the agora across much of the 20th century, confirmed the approximate location of the structure through excavation, the ground itself yielding evidence of where the columns had stood and the wall had run. The Stoa Poikile is gone now in any form that could shelter a person from sun or rain, but the location is recoverable. The archaeology gives back not the building, but the ground it rested on, and a ground that has been located is a ground that can be stood on again in imagination with a precision that purely textual philosophy cannot quite provide. The compressed earth where the columns stood, the line along which the wall ran, the approximate distance from the open road to the painted figures behind the teaching space. This matters in a quiet way. Philosophy can feel as though it exists only in the pages of books or in the abstract space of argument, nowhere really, and therefore always and everywhere equally. To know that it happened in a specific place, that the place can be found, that the ground is still there, is to bring philosophy back into the world where it was always practiced. A person with real feet stood on real stone. The rain, when it came, fell into the open colonnade at an angle. The light in the afternoon crossed the floor in a particular direction. A merchant who was crossing the agora on his way to other business might have paused at the open edge of the Stoa Poikile. Something in the quality of the conversation would have been audible from the road, not its content necessarily, not the specific argument at that specific moment, but something in the tone, the measured pace of a voice that is working through something rather than selling something, a pause, an answer, another pause, the rhythm of a conversation in which nothing is being rushed toward, in which the direction of the next sentence is not determined in advance, in which the speaker seems content to let the question remain present a little longer before offering anything. The merchant might have stood at the edge of the columns for a moment, neither inside the porch nor outside it, in exactly the position the architecture made available, the threshold of the colonnade where the roof's shadow begins, but nothing prevents stepping back into the sunlight. Perhaps he would have stayed. Perhaps after a moment he would have continued across the square. Either way, the building made space for the possibility. The threshold was open. The invitation was not issued from a closed room through a door that needed to be knocked on. This was not accidental. Among the things that distinguished Zeno's school from some of the philosophical communities of his time was precisely this. The teaching was happening in a public place, in the middle of the city's daily activity, audible to anyone who passed within range. There were schools that met in gymnasiums that had social affiliations, in spaces that were bounded by the assumptions of who was expected to be there. The Stoa Poikile had no such boundary. The columns simply stood, the roof simply covered, the teaching simply continued. The agora visible through the columns in the middle of the day was not an idealized space. It was a working place. The people crossing it were doing so for practical reasons, commerce, civic obligation, the ordinary movement of urban life. They brought noise. They brought the weight of their own preoccupations, their debts and their appointments, and the things they had said that morning that they perhaps wished they had not said. Into this moving, imperfect, fully inhabited square, the philosophy opened. In the early mornings, before the day's business filled the agora with its noise, the Stoa Poikile was empty and still in the way that sheltered outdoor spaces are still when no one is in them. The painted panels would have been visible in the growing light, the marathon warriors slightly flattened by shadow, the colors gathering depth as the light strengthened. The columns cast regular shadows across the stone floor, shifting slowly as the sun climbed. The open road beyond the columns would have been quiet, the agora not yet full, the city in the particular suspension that belongs to the hour before the day properly begins. In that empty morning, the porch held two things at once: the painted history on its back wall and the open future of the square in front of it. Both were visible from the same position. A person standing at the center of the porch's length, in the cool of the early hour, could look at the marathon panels and then turn their head and look through the columns at the empty agora, past and present sharing the same frame, neither one canceling the other out. The building made this possible simply through its orientation, through the fact of having a solid painted wall on one side and open columns on the other. This double facing is worth sitting with for a moment. The Stoa Poikile was not oriented away from history. The marathon panels were not decoration that happened to exist in the space where philosophy was taught. They were there on purpose, part of the building's original function as a civic structure before philosophy arrived in it. Zeno chose a building that already carried its civic history, and he added to it a philosophical practice that was itself, in its own way, a civic commitment, the commitment to teach in the open center of the city rather than in a private chamber. The porch did not resolve this into a single clean meaning. It held the tension without difficulty, the way well-made architecture tends to hold tensions without needing to resolve them into simplicity. History on one side, the present on the other, a roof overhead that sheltered both. Among the various kinds of buildings that the ancient world made for public gathering, the covered markets, the stoas that lined the edges of sanctuaries and civic centers, the long porticos that provided shelter along busy roads. The stoa as a type had a particular character. It was not a building that enclosed. A theater enclosed, gathered the audience inside a defined boundary, and arranged them in relation to a fixed focal point. A temple enclosed, separated the sacred from the profane, with walls and a single controlled entrance. Even the gymnasium, open as it was, had its walls, its gates, its sense of belonging to a defined community of users. The stoa was different, roofed along its length, supported by columns, open entirely along one long face. It was architecture in a mode of invitation rather than enclosure. It offered shelter without demanding entrance. The protection it provided was real, but did not come at the cost of exposure to the world. Standing inside a stoa, a person remained visible to the agora. Standing outside, a person could see exactly what was happening under the roof. The building made opacity impossible, and made the act of entering or not entering a continuum rather than a binary. This is the kind of detail that can seem merely descriptive, merely architectural, until the philosophy it was teaching in is remembered. And then the building and the teaching become difficult to separate. To stand in a space that shelters without enclosing, that protects without sealing off, that makes visible what it contains, and keeps in contact with everything outside. This is to inhabit, in physical form, a certain ideal of engagement, not withdrawn, not overwhelmed, present to the world with something solid at one's back. Zeno walked along the length of the porch as he taught. Ancient sources describe this as characteristic of him, the movement, the pace that matched the rhythm of speech, the way the teaching happened in motion rather than from a fixed position. The students moved with him or waited for him to return. The porch accommodated this. A building with a single podium or a single altar demands stasis, demands that the focal point hold still and the attention orient toward it. A long covered walk offers no such demand. It is made for movement. The footsteps of the teacher would have been part of the soundscape of the teaching, the soft percussion of someone walking slowly, the columns sliding past in the background, the agora rotating slightly in the frame of the colonnade as the angle changed. There is something in this that is worth holding. The teaching was happening in a space that matched its content. The content was not a set of conclusions to be delivered from a fixed point and received by a fixed audience. It was a practice, a way of attending to impressions, of holding judgments carefully, of returning again and again to the question of what actually belongs to the will and what does not. A practice, not a monument, something done repeatedly, reviewed, refined, set down, and returned to. The space of the porch, with its long walkable length and its open edge, made room for exactly this quality of philosophical life. The citizens of Athens who saw the group moving slowly in the porch, who recognized after weeks and months that this was where a particular teacher could be found at particular hours, would have been watching something new. Not new in the sense that nothing similar had existed before, but new in the sense that this specific combination of place and teaching and person had not previously been available in this location. The agora had acquired a resident philosophical practice, housed in one of its own public structures, available to anyone who passed along the northern road. The light in the porch changed as the day progressed. By afternoon, it was different from what it had been at the morning's start. The shadows of the columns shifted. The painted panels on the back wall received the light at a different angle. The quality of illumination in the sheltered space softened. The agora outside changed too. Different people crossing. The commercial activity in a different register. The temperature of the stone underfoot slightly warmer than it had been. None of this interrupted the teaching. The teaching moved through it all the way a slow river moves through, changing terrain, adjusted by what it met, but not diverted from its direction. This quality of persistence in the face of passing time and changing condition is not incidental. A philosophy of equanimity, taught in the middle of a city's daily activity, through the movement of a full day, demonstrated something through its situation that it was simultaneously arguing in words. The arguments about the nature of what does and does not lie within the rational will were being made in a place where the wind came and went, where the temperature shifted, where the noise of the agora swelled and receded, where the light moved steadily across the floor from morning to evening. The practice and its setting were already in agreement. The painted figures on the back wall watched all of it. They watched the morning students and the afternoon passers-by. They watched the empty porch in the early hours and the animated discussions of midday. They had been watching this stretch of public space since before philosophy arrived in it, and they would watch it after. The marathon warriors in particular, that scene of men deciding to hold their position when the rational response might have been to reconsider, to fall back, to wait for better conditions, offered from the back of the porch a kind of silent commentary on the teaching happening in front of them. Not agreement, exactly, not illustration, something more like resonance, the way two distinct notes played together produce a third quality that neither contains alone. Zeno had not chosen this porch because of its paintings. He had chosen it, the ancient sources suggest, because it was in the agora, because it was open, because it was public. But the paintings were there when he arrived, and they remained while he taught. And to read the philosophy that came out of that porch without some awareness of the painted soldiers behind the columns is to read it with one of its most persistent visual contexts removed. Virtue, for the Stoics, was not withdrawal. It was not the achievement of a person who had simplified their life to the point where nothing could threaten it. The marathon panels were not on that wall because courage is uncomplicated, or because civic commitment is easy. They were there because the human version of the rational will, when it commits to what it genuinely holds to be right, sometimes does so against considerable external pressure. The equanimity that Zeno was describing in the Porch was not the calm of someone to whom nothing difficult had come. It was the calm that becomes possible when the rational faculty has genuinely separated what it can govern from what it cannot, and has concentrated its entire resources on the former without reservation. This is a subtle distinction, and it is not one that architecture can make fully. But architecture can make it approachable. A porch that shelters without enclosing puts a person in a situation, not an argument, not a proposition, but a situation where the distinction between inner steadiness and outer engagement is already the shape of the space they are standing in. The teaching had a room that fit it. In the quiet of the very early morning, before anyone else had arrived, before the agora had begun to fill, the Stoa Poikiel stood exactly as it had stood through the night, columns and roof and painted wall, the open colonnade facing the empty square. The first light came from the east and moved across the stone floor of the porch, crossing it slowly, the shadows of the columns shifting by degrees too small to observe at any single moment, but unmistakable across the span of an hour. The marathon panels received the morning light in stages. Depending on the angle of the sun and the season of the year, certain figures would emerge from the surrounding color first, catching the light before the others did, briefly prominent before the illumination evened out across the whole composition. A soldier's raised arm, the edge of a shield. A figure at the far left of the panel, whose posture suggests that he is looking towards something outside the frame, something the viewer cannot see. In the time before the students arrived, and before the agora began its day, this light moved across the painted figures and across the stone floor in complete silence. The porch held this without needing to do anything with it. The history on the back wall and the open square in front, both present, both visible, both held within the same long sheltered space, rested in each other's company, without resolution, without conclusion, without the noise that the day would shortly bring. And then the day came. Voices, footsteps on the road outside, the sounds of the agora assembling itself into its daily form, merchants and magistrates and curious citizens, a man walking between the columns, unhurried, beginning to speak, his footsteps on the worn stone, as regular as the shadows of the columns were regular, the open air of the agora visible and audible along the entire length of the porch's face. The columns stood between the teaching and the city, not as barriers, not as walls, but as the open framework of a space that did not require the city to stop in order to begin. The sounds came through, the light came through. People could look in, people could walk in, people could stand at the edge, one foot still on the road, and listen to a sentence or two before deciding what to do next. This was the Stoa Poikila, in the time when Zeno was walking its length. A structure the city had built for one set of purposes: civic shelter, the display of martial history, the provision of public covered space, that had become, without being altered in any physical way, a school. The columns were the same columns, the paintings were the same paintings. The stone floor was the stone floor. It had always been, and within that unchanged architecture, something was happening that the architecture itself seemed to have been, from the beginning, quietly prepared to hold. The columns framed the open square of the agora, that long row of vertical stone carrying a roof above and casting regular shadow below, open along the face that faces the city, solid along the back where the marathon warriors stand in their painted stillness. Neither wall nor window, The columns are something between enclosure and exposure, something that creates shelter without creating separation. To stand between them at the open edge of the porch, with the agora in front and the painted history behind, is to inhabit a position that asks nothing of the person standing there except presence, not withdrawal from the world, not immersion in it past the point of any steadiness, presence to it, held but not enclosed, in contact with everything the square contains, and sheltered enough to think. That was the space, that was the porch, and in the long, patient quiet of the morning before the day arrive, it stood holding both directions at once, the city's activity and the painted soldier's stillness, the open square and the solid wall, the sound of a world continuing, and the silence of history that has already settled into its own meaning and asked nothing more than to be stood in. Zeno drew a line in the air with his open hand. It was a gesture his students had come to know, a slow lateral movement, as if separating two liquids that had been mixed, returning them to their original containers. Ancient sources note that he used his hands to illustrate philosophical divisions, that his teaching was a physical thing as well as a spoken one, the body making arguments the voice could then follow. On this particular morning, or on a morning very much like it, the hand moved through the shadow of the Stoa Poikiel and divided the world in two. On one side, everything that belonged, fully and without qualification, to the rational will. On the other, everything that did not. The students watched the gesture before the words arrived. That interval, the hand having moved, the explanation not yet given, was itself a small demonstration of what the philosophy would ask of them: to pause, to see the division before naming it, to let the world arrange itself into its two regions before deciding how to act inside them. What Zeno was drawing was not a line between good and bad, or between pleasant and painful, or between things that lasted and things that passed. Those familiar divisions were everywhere in ancient philosophy, worn smooth by use, and he was doing something different. He was dividing the world according to a criterion almost no one before him had placed at the center of ethics. He was asking, before any other question, what of all the things that fill a life actually belongs to the person living it. The answer, when it came, was smaller than almost anyone expected. And inside that smallness was something that would prove, for many people across many centuries, to be enough. Zeno organized what he was doing into three connected inquiries. He called them, or his students came to call them, logic, physics, and ethics. These were not separate buildings. They were more like three rooms whose walls were also doors, so that moving deeply enough into any one of them brought a person to the threshold of the others. To understand how knowledge worked, it turned out, required an account of what the world was made of. To understand what the world was made of required an account of what it meant to live well inside it. And to understand what it meant to live well required returning, eventually, to the question of how the mind could be trusted to know anything at all. The three rooms opened onto one another. The philosophy was designed that way. Begin with logic, because that is where Zeno began, or where the tradition records him beginning. Not logic in the narrow modern sense of formal rules for valid inference, though that was part of it. Something broader. The question of how a mind receives the world, and what it then does with what it has received. When something appears to a person, a sound heard, a face recognized, a memory arriving uninvited, a fear rising before its cause has been identified. The Stoics called this a asterisk fantasia, asterisk an impression. The word carried the sense of something pressing itself against a surface, leaving its shape. The world presses against the mind and leaves an impression, and the mind has to decide what to do with what has been pressed. This was where Zeno located the decisive moment of philosophical practice. Not in grand decisions about how to live a life, not in the large visible choices that other philosophical traditions tended to place at the center of ethics. Here, at the threshold between the impression arriving and the response given, in the narrow interval between what appears and what the mind ratifies as real, the word for ratifying an impression was asterisk, synkatathesis. Asterisk, assent. The act of saying yes, I hold this to be true. I accept this as a genuine picture of the world. I will act as if this is what the situation actually is. Zeno's argument was that this act of assent, small and mostly invisible, was the location of philosophical freedom, not because impressions could be prevented. They could not. The fear rises before the mind has examined it. The desire arrives before philosophy has assessed its worth. The impression comes as impressions always come, without asking permission, without announcing itself, without leaving time for careful preparation. But the assent is another matter. Between the impression and the assent, however brief that interval seems, something lives. A rational capacity to pause, a possibility of asking whether what appears is what is, whether the fear the mind has received corresponds to something genuinely threatening, or whether it is a story the impression has told that does not survive examination, whether the desire, if followed, would lead towards something that actually belongs in the category of good. The Stoic practitioner was not someone who felt nothing. That was a misunderstanding the school's critics made often, and the school's members took some trouble to correct. The Stoic practitioner was someone who had learned to notice the interval, to live, gradually and imperfectly, in the pause between impression and assent. Not because the pause made the world safer or more comfortable, but because in that pause, and only there, something belonging entirely to the rational self could be exercised. This was the logic, and it opened immediately into the physics. Because the question of why the interval mattered, why assent was more than mere hesitation, why the pause was genuinely a location of something real, required an account of what kind of world a rational self was living inside. If the world were arbitrary, or indifferent, or governed by no principle at all, then the careful exercise of rational judgment would be merely personal preference, a habit some people found useful and others did not, no more philosophically significant than preferring one flavor of wine. What Zeno proposed instead was a world ordered by reason all the way through. The name for this ordering principle was the Logos, not a god in the way most Athenians understood the term, not a figure with intentions and a face, capable of being pleased or angered, accessible through ritual and offering, something both more intimate and more impersonal than that. The rational principle that ran through all things and held them in their relations, the intelligence, if intelligence is the right word, according to which fire behaves like fire and not like water, according to which the seasons return in their order, according to which causes produce their effects, with something closer to necessity than to chance. It was the reason things were legible. A world without logos would be a world of pure noise, events occurring without connection, patterns with no principle behind them, effects divorced from causes, causes producing nothing predictable. Such a world could not be known. There would be nothing to know, only events, each one isolated. What Zeno was pointing at when he named the Logos was the condition that made understanding possible, the fact that the world had a grammar, and that the mind, being rational, shared in that grammar. This is what made the assent matter. The mind pausing before an impression was not pausing arbitrarily. It was pausing in order to ask whether the impression aligned with what the world actually was, with the rational structure running through it. The mind could do this because the mind was not separate from the logos, but a local instance of it. A person reasoning carefully was not merely thinking private thoughts. The person was participating in the same rational order that kept the stars in their paths and the river in its banks. Imagine looking at a river and watching it move. The surface is restless. Water catches and breaks the light. Eddies form and dissolve. The current shifts around obstructions and reassembles itself downstream. Nothing on the surface holds still. But something in the river is utterly consistent. The way water moves, the pressure of the current, the behavior of the whole in response to the shape of its channel. What holds is not visible the way the surface is visible. It is the principle by which all the surface movement occurs. The logos was something like that, not the surface events of experience, each one arriving and departing, but the principle by which they moved and what they amounted to. And a person who had understood this, who had genuinely seen that the rational order of things was not an imposition from outside, but the very structure of what the world was, that person stood in a different relation to the events of daily life. Not because the events would be different. They would not, but because what the events were, in their deepest category, had been understood, and this is where the physics opened into the ethics. If the world is rational all the way through, and if the rational mind is a local instance of that same universal rationality, then the question of how to live is not a question about personal preference or social convention or the accumulated wisdom of a particular culture. It is a question about what it means to live in accordance with what one actually is. The Stoic ethical injunction to live according to nature, to live according to reason, the phrases were used interchangeably, was not a vague encouragement toward wholesome behavior. It was a precise philosophical claim that the self most fully exercised is the rational self, and that the rational self, when fully exercised, participates in the governing order of the whole. This was the ground on which Zeno built his most demanding and most distinctive claim. Virtue is the only unconditional good. Pause with that for a moment, because the pause is warranted, not because the claim is shocking, though to most people on first hearing it is at least surprising, but because the full weight of what it was saying takes time to settle. Every other thing that human beings routinely call good, health, wealth, pleasure, fame, safety, the love of particular people, the continued existence of what one has worked to build, every one of these things was placed by Zeno into a different category, not into the category of bad things. The Stoics were not ascetics who despised comfort or cultivated suffering as a discipline. The claim was more precise and stranger than that. These things, health, wealth, pleasure, the rest, were placed into the category of things that do not belong to the unconditionally good, things whose value depends on conditions outside the self, things that can be present and then absent, gained and then lost, held and then taken, things over which finally the rational will has no guaranteed authority. The word the tradition used for them was asterisk, adiaphora, asterisk, indifferent things, which did not mean that a Stoic was indifferent to whether they had enough food or whether the people they loved were safe. The tradition was careful to distinguish between things that are unconditionally good and things that are reasonably preferred. Health is reasonably preferred to illness. Enough food is reasonably preferred to hunger. A stable life is reasonably preferred to a chaotic one. These preferences are rational and appropriate, and a Stoic would pursue them sensibly. But sensibly is the word, not desperately, not at the cost of the one thing that cannot be taken. A student at the Stoa, early in his time there, might ask why the distinction mattered. He might ask, and the sources suggest students did ask, whether the philosophy was asking him to pretend that losing his livelihood, or his health, or his family was somehow not a real loss. That would be either dishonest or inhuman, and he might say so respectfully to his teacher. Zeno's answer, or something like it, moved through the distinction between what is lost and what is damaged. When a wave takes cargo, and for a merchant from a trading family, the image would have arrived naturally. What the wave takes is real, the cargo is gone. The loss is not a philosophical illusion to be dissolved by correct thinking. A serious philosophy does not pretend losses away. But there is a question to be asked in the wreckage, and the question is whether anything else went with the cargo. Whether the person in the water has lost something from the category that cannot be taken by waves. The capacity to reason, well and honestly, about what has happened. The capacity to assess the situation without a false story in either direction, neither the story that nothing matters, nor the story that everything is ruined. The capacity to decide from among the real options that actually exist what to do next. The capacity to remain, even in loss, what a rational being is. That capacity, those capacities, which are finally one capacity expressed in different directions, was what Zeno placed in the category of the unconditional good, virtue. Not virtue in a narrowly moral sense, as if it were about particular behaviors on a list. Virtue in the older, broader Greek sense, the excellence proper to a thing, what a thing is when it is fully what it is. The excellence proper to a rational being, the full and unimpeded exercise of reason in the conduct of a life. This could not be taken by a wave. This was not on the ship. That was the ethical claim, and it rested on the physical claim, which rested on the logical claim. The three rooms were connected. The ascent mattered because the mind was rational. The mind's rationality mattered because the world itself was rational. And the world's rationality meant that to live in full exercise of one's reason was not merely personally useful, but cosmically appropriate. A human life shaped according to the same principle that shaped everything else. There is an image that the Stoic tradition would return to across centuries in different formulations as a way of making this triangle of ideas felt rather than merely understood. The image of a craftsman and a well-made object. A craftsman who knows the material he is working with, who understands the grain of the wood or the temper of the metal, who has developed through long practice the judgment to know how much pressure is needed here and how much patience is needed there, who sees in the raw material not only what it is, but what it is capable of becoming. This craftsman, working well, exercises something that the Stoics would recognize as virtue in the technical sense. Not moral virtue specifically, though moral virtue would share the structure, the excellence proper to a craftsman, the fully developed rational capacity to understand the material and work with it well. What the Stoics were asking was whether a person could be that craftsman with respect to life itself, with respect to the whole of experience as it arrived, the favorable conditions and the adverse ones, the things that came when hoped for and the things that came when they were not, the long ordinary stretches and the moments that required everything available. The craftsman working with difficult material does not pretend the difficulty away. The wood is dense here, the metal is uneven there. To pretend otherwise would produce bad work, because bad work begins in a false picture of the material. The craftsman acknowledges what is, and then, from the accurate perception of what is, brings to bear the skill that the long practice has built. What Zeno was teaching in the three rooms that opened onto one another was something like that kind of skill, not the skill of a particular trade, the skill of living, of receiving what the world sends, perceiving it accurately, neither catastrophizing nor dismissing, and then responding from the center of what is genuinely under rational control, rather than from the periphery where fortune decides. The periphery was wide and real and mattered. The territory at the center where the rational will genuinely lived was comparatively narrow, but it was unassailable. That was the word the tradition came back to in different ways from different directions. Within the domain of the rational will, properly exercised, there was no force that could reach, not poverty, not physical pain, not the loss of reputation, or the failure of plans, or the collapse of what had been carefully built, not even death, because death was in the category of things not up to us, and a thing not up to us cannot, by the Stoic account, be unconditionally bad. This was not a comfortable philosophy. It asked a great deal. It asked for a kind of honesty about what is and is not within the self's control that most people, most of the time, find easier to avoid than to face. It is easier to believe that the cargo matters unconditionally, that if the cargo goes, something essential goes with it, because that belief, however painful, requires less rearrangement of the self's internal architecture than the alternative. The alternative asked a person to locate themselves, genuinely and stably, in the narrow territory of the rational will, to treat everything outside that territory, not with indifference exactly, but with what the tradition called equanimity, a steady, clear-eyed relationship to the things that cannot be controlled, neither rejecting them nor depending on them, preferring the good ones reasonably, accepting the adverse ones without a story that transforms them into something they are not, and then continuing to exercise, in whatever conditions actually obtain, the one faculty that conditions cannot touch. There was a gesture Zeno used. Ancient sources say, to illustrate the final distinction, he would hold his hand open and flat, palm upward. This, he said, is an impression, the world arriving in the mind, the open hand receiving what comes. Then he would begin to close the fingers slightly, not all the way. This, he said, is the beginning of assent, the mind beginning to ratify what has arrived, to hold it as real. Then the hand would close fully. This is full assent, the impression held as true, the world committed to, and then, and this is where the gesture became something more than illustration, he would close one hand around the other fist. This, he said, is knowledge, not merely belief, not merely assent, but the grasped certainty of a mind that has examined the impression fully and found it sound. The gesture moved through the whole epistemology. In a few seconds, the world arrives, the mind receives, the mind asks, the mind holds or releases. And in the holding and releasing, in the practiced exercise of rational assent, applied again and again to everything the world sends, something gradually forms, a character, a stability, a self that is not at the mercy of what arrives, because it has developed, through practice, the capacity to meet what arrives with clear eyes. The three rooms of the philosophy held this shape. Logic described the practice of assent and its importance. Physics explained why the practice was not arbitrary, but grounded in the rational structure of the world itself. Ethics traced what it meant to live a life built around that practice, to make the exercise of rational virtue not an occasional achievement, but the steady orientation of a whole life. None of this was easy to learn. The school at the Stoa was not a place where difficult truths were softened into comfort, but something about the structure of the ideas, once genuinely understood rather than merely acknowledged, tended toward a particular quality of calm, not the calm of someone who has given up caring, not the calm of detachment or distance, something more precise, the calm of someone who has found the place inside themselves where the storm does not reach and has learned to live there. The Logos moves through everything, through the argument just concluded, and through the breath between sentences, through the regular turning of seasons and the less regular turning of a night toward morning. It is not a distant governing principle, observable only from a theoretical height. It is what makes a rational thought possible, what makes one idea follow from another, what gives consistency to the mind's encounter with the world across a life long enough for patterns to emerge. A student at the Stoa in the early morning, sitting with this, the three rooms and what they contained, the gesture of the open and closing hand, the narrow but unassailable territory of the rational will, might find the ideas arriving not as a burden, but as something else, as a kind of arrangement, as a way of understanding why the distinction between what is up to us and what is not, which seems at first to shrink the territory of the self, actually opens something. The territory that opens is not wide in the way that having many things is wide. It does not expand outward into the world of events and objects and other people's choices and the movements of fortune. It deepens rather than widens. It becomes more stable as it is practiced. It becomes over time the ground that holds rather than the thing that must be protected. What Zeno set down in the Stoa, in the three connected rooms of logic and physics and ethics, in the gesture of the open hand, in the claim that virtue was the only unconditional good, and that the rational will was its only reliable home, was a way of living inside the world's uncertainty without being governed by it. Not by escaping the uncertainty, not by pretending it was less than it was, but by finding, within the movement and loss and contingency of an ordinary life, something that did not move. The Logos holds all things in their relations. It is the reason the world is legible, the reason a careful argument can reach somewhere true, the reason one night follows another in their long procession. It runs through the breath now slowing, and the mind now quieting, and the darkness that holds, without difficulty, everything at rest inside it. The rational current beneath the surface of things does not require attention in order to continue. It was here before the philosophy named it. It will be here when the naming is done. It asks only to be noticed, quietly, without urgency, in the interval between the impression and the ascent, in the small space where a life, meeting the world honestly, can choose what it will become. The hand opens, the world arrives. And in the pause before the hand closes, in that brief and inexhaustible pause, the philosophy Zeno was building had its quietest and most enduring home. Zeno arrived at the door of Crates of Thebes the way most people arrive at important thresholds, with hesitation dressed as consideration. He had been directed there by a bookseller, which is to say he had been directed there by chance, which is to say the circumstances of his life had been arranged by no one in particular to bring him to this specific street in Athens at this specific hour, standing outside the presence of a man who would, over the following years, change the shape of everything Zeno thought was possible to think. Crates was not difficult to find. Ancient sources describe him as a constant presence in the open spaces of the city, the kind of figure who occupies a corner of a street or a step near a fountain with such unhurried completeness that he seems to have been there always, as if the city were built around him rather than the other way around. He was a Theban by birth, a cynic by practice, a former man of means who had at some point given away his property with what his contemporaries described as cheerfulness, and who wore a rough cloak that announced, more eloquently than any speech, his settled opinion on the worth of material comfort. He was not performing poverty. He had simply decided that what everyone else was running toward was not worth the energy of the running, and his whole bearing communicated this conclusion without urgency, without contempt, with something closer to a mild and durable amusement. Zeno watched him. This is the part of the account that matters most, and also the part the ancient sources describe most sparsely, the interval before instruction begins, when a student is still assessing whether the teacher is real. There is a kind of argument that does not live in words. Crates made this argument simply by existing in the way he existed, his pace when he walked, the quality of his attention when someone spoke to him, the absence of the small anxious adjustments that most people make continuously without noticing. Zeno, who had lost a cargo to the sea and found himself in Athens with no commercial purpose and no settled sense of what came next, watched this man and recognized something he could not yet name. The name he would eventually find for it was virtue, but the recognition came first, before the name, the way almost all genuine learning arrives. What Crates taught in the lineage of Diogenes of Sinope before him was not a system. The Cynics were deeply suspicious of systems, of the elaborate philosophical architecture by which thinkers build impressive structures around ideas that could have been stated plainly and lived without further decoration. The core of what Crates transmitted was a conviction that virtue is entirely sufficient, not partially sufficient, not sufficient under most circumstances, but fully and unconditionally sufficient for a good human life. Whatever else a person might accumulate or lose in the course of living, the one thing that cannot be taken by any external event is the quality of the inner life, the character of the choices made, the integrity of the person making them. Wealth can be lost to a creditor. Health can be taken by illness. Reputation is subject to the opinion of whoever holds the most power in the room. But the disposition toward honest engagement with the world, the practice of acting from considered judgment, rather than from fear or habit or appetite, that, Crates insisted through the medium of his whole existence, is yours in a way nothing else can be. Zeno heard this and felt the shape of something true. He was young enough that the feeling itself was sufficient to hold him there. He stayed. The months of study under Crates were not comfortable. Cynic pedagogy was not designed for comfort. Ancient sources record that Crates once sent Zeno across the Athenian agora carrying a pot of lentil soup, and when Zeno tried to conceal it under his cloak, embarrassed, apparently, by the undignified image, Crates smashed the pot with his staff, so that the soup ran down Zeno's leg in full view of the marketplace crowd. And Crates told him, without particular unkindness, to stop being afraid of what people thought. The incident may have been embellished in the retelling. What it describes accurately, embellished or not, is a pedagogical method organized entirely around the dismantling of conventional anxiety. You are ashamed of the soup because you care what passers-by think of you. You care what passers-by think of you because you believe their opinion constitutes something real, something that could actually diminish you. It does not. Nothing outside you diminishes what is inside you unless you allow the diminishment, and allowing it is a choice, made from habit so old it no longer feels like a choice. This was the lesson. It was delivered in lentils. The form was intentional. Zeno absorbed the Cynic insight and held it seriously. He did not, however, remain entirely a Cynic. What he found, after enough time walking in Crates' vicinity, was that the Cynic tradition contained something essential, but also something incomplete, or rather, something that stated a truth without fully explaining why it was true. to say that virtue is sufficient to demonstrate through one's own life that the indifference to conventional goods is possible and sustainable is a powerful argument of a certain kind. But Zeno wanted to understand the ground beneath that argument. He wanted to know why the person of genuine virtue cannot ultimately be harmed. Not just that they cannot, Crates made that visible, but why at the level of what the universe actually is and how it is actually organized. That question led him somewhere older. Heraclitus of Ephesus had written in the late 6th century, before the Common Era, in a style so compressed and oblique that his contemporaries called him the Dark One, not as insult, but as acknowledgment that the difficulty in his sentences was not accidental. He was not being obscure for the pleasure of it. He was trying to describe something genuinely difficult, something about the relationship between the apparent chaos of the visible world and the hidden order that governs it. The river looks different every time you stand beside it. The water is never the same water. The surface shifts and breaks and reforms continuously, and yet it is recognizably the same river, flowing in the same direction, holding the same shape, not despite the constant change, but through it, because of it. What holds the river together across all its endless becoming is something that has no visible substance of its own. Heraclitus called it the Logos. The Logos in Heraclitus is the rational law that governs flux. It is the principle by which opposites are held in productive tension rather than mutual cancellation. Day and night are not the failure of each other. They are the expression of a cycle that requires both. Hot and cold are not opposites at war. They are poles of a continuum that the world needs in order to be the world. What looks like contradiction in the surface experience of things resolves at a deeper level into the ordered movement of a single underlying intelligence, not a god in the familiar mythological sense, present sometimes and absent others, with preferences and moods, but something closer to a grammar, the rational structure that makes the universe say something rather than nothing, that makes its behavior follow principles rather than caprice. Zeno encountered this in the texts, and something clarified. The Cynic conviction that virtue is sufficient had been, for him, a truth held by intuition and demonstrated by the example of Crates. Now it began to acquire a ground. If the universe is organized by a rational principle, if the Logos is genuinely what Heraclitus described, a universal intelligence pervading and structuring all of existence, then the human being who lives in accordance with reason is not simply making a personal choice. That person is aligning themselves with what the universe fundamentally is. The good life is not arbitrary, not merely one preference among others. It is the life lived in consonance with the rational order of everything. This was a significant move. It transformed the Cynic position from a courageous personal stance into something with cosmological weight. But Zeno was not yet finished gathering. Socrates had died before Zeno was born, 100 years or so before the founding of the Stoa, condemned by an Athenian jury on charges of impiety and corrupting the young. What Zeno inherited from Socrates was not a system of doctrine. Socrates famously left no written texts, and his philosophical method was constituted entirely by conversation, by the patient questioning of assumptions, but something more durable than doctrine. He inherited an example of what philosophy, fully lived, actually looks like in a human being. The account in Plato's Phaedo is not primarily an argument about the soul. The argument about the soul is there, patient and careful, and genuinely interesting, but the deeper argument the dialogue makes is about the man at its center, who sits on the last morning of his life with his friends around him and reasons calmly about the nature of death and the good, not as a performance of courage, not as a demonstration for posterity, but because this is simply what Socrates does, what he has always done, and the approach of the hemlock alters none of it. He asks questions, he tests answers, he follows the argument where it leads. He does not allow the magnitude of the occasion to collapse the quality of his attention. The room, Plato's text suggests, became quieter the longer Socrates spoke, not heavier, not more strained, but quieter in the way that a space becomes quieter when something true is being said in it. What Zeno took from this was the Stoic claim in its most essential form, given not as an argument, but as a demonstration. The person of genuine philosophical integrity cannot be harmed by any external event. Not harmed in the way that finally matters, in the life of the mind, in the quality of inner engagement with reality. Socrates had been sentenced to death and had gone to that death without the kind of interior disruption that most people assume would be inevitable, because the things being taken from him, his remaining years, his liberty, eventually his life, were not in the Socratic accounting the things that constituted what was genuinely his to keep. What was his to keep was his character, his reasoning, his honest engagement with the question of how to live. Those the jury could not touch. The hemlock could not touch them. His equanimity in the face of what was happening was not Stoicism in the modern debased sense, gritted teeth, suppressed distress, but the natural condition of someone who had already understood clearly what was his and what was not. Zeno carried this. He would carry it for the rest of his long life, and it would remain visible in everything the Stoic tradition built around his founding insight. There was one more current to gather. Stilpo of Megara led a school whose primary concern was the formal structure of argument itself, the logical conditions under which a claim could be said to follow from other claims, the analysis of conditional statements, the grammar of reasoning made explicit and precise. Zeno studied there, and what he absorbed was a discipline he could not have found in Crates, or in Heraclitus, or in Plato's account of Socrates. The Cynics had no interest in formal logic. Their arguments worked through example and through the lived force of their own existence. Heraclitus was a poet of paradox rather than a logician. Socrates questioned premises, but never developed a formal theory of inference. The Megarians were doing something different. They were examining the structure of reasoning itself, asking not just what was true, but under what conditions something could be established as true, what it meant for one statement to necessitate another, what the logical form of a valid argument was. This was the skeleton that Stoic philosophy needed, and that Zeno found at the school of Stilpo, not the warm living body of ethical commitment that Crates had given him, not the cosmological imagination that could see rational order in the movement of rivers and the cycle of seasons that came from Heraclitus, not the moral exemplarism, the demonstration of a life fully lived by its own deepest principles that came from Socrates through Plato's account of those last conversations. What the Megarians gave was the precision, the formal structure, the capacity to build arguments that could be examined at the level of their logical joints and either held or found wanting. Chrysippus, who would come later and build the great Stoic logical edifice, could only do what he did because Zeno had passed through this school and understood what rigorous formal argument demanded. The young man who had stood outside Crates' door with something between hesitation and resolve had become, through these years of patient gathering, something that is difficult to name but recognizable when described. A person who has absorbed multiple traditions deeply enough to feel both what they contribute and where they reach their limit, and who is beginning to sense that the limits of each are exactly where another begins. Cynic ethics tells you that virtue is sufficient, but cannot tell you why. Polyclitan cosmology tells you the world is rationally ordered, but says little about how to act within it. Socratic exemplarism shows you the life, but does not systematize the argument behind it. Megarian logic gives you the tools for rigorous demonstration, but nothing to demonstrate. Each tradition had given Zeno something essential. None of them, held alone, was the whole of what he was beginning to think. There must have been a period, somewhere in the long middle of his Athenian formation, when Zeno was holding all of this at once and had not yet found the form that would allow it to cohere. This is a familiar experience to anyone who has spent serious time inside more than one way of thinking about the same deep question. The traditions are all present in the mind simultaneously, and they do not always speak the same language, and the work of understanding how they belong together is patient and slow, and cannot be forced by wanting it to be finished sooner. What Zeno was assembling, piece by piece through those years, was not merely a new philosophical school. He was building a particular kind of architecture, one in which ethics did not float free of the world it was practiced in which the claim that virtue is sufficient was grounded in a cosmological account of what the universe actually is, in which the logical tools existed to make that account rigorous, and in which a human model, Socrates, barefoot and calm and uncorrupted by the approach of death, stood at the center as living proof. The cynics had told him that what the world calls important is not important. He accepted this and went further. The world is not organized arbitrarily. There is a rational structure to it, a logos that runs through all of its movements, and so the person who learns to live in accordance with reason is not merely adopting a contrarian personal style, as the cynics sometimes seem to be doing with their aggressive performances of indifference. That person is discovering how to live in accordance with the actual nature of things. Virtue is not sufficient because conventions are empty and deserve our contempt. Virtue is sufficient because the universe is a rational whole, and the human being is the part of it in which that rationality becomes conscious of itself, and to act from genuine virtue is to act from what is most fundamentally real in us. This was a complete thought. It had taken decades to gather. There is an old scholarly observation about the Stoic tradition that catches something genuinely true about what Zeno achieved. It notes that without Zeno, there would have been no Chrysippus, and that without Chrysippus, there would have been no Stoa in the form that survived and spread and entered the Roman world and reached Marcus Aurelius in his private quarters and passed eventually into the hands of anyone who has ever read the asterisk meditations, asterisk late at night, and recognized the instruction as if they had always already known it. The chain is real and matters, but chains are made of individual links, and the first link is always the thing to ask about, not what followed from it, not where the chain eventually reached, but the moment of its forging, the act of holding disparate materials together until they find the configuration in which they belong. Crates had given Zeno ethics in its most radical form, a man who had proven by living that the goods everyone was pursuing were not, in fact, the good. Heraclitus had given him the cosmos as a rational whole, governed by a principle that made the world's apparent chaos intelligible from a sufficient depth of perspective. Socrates had given him the human demonstration of what it looks like when a person has genuinely internalized this understanding, not the theory of equanimity, but its living embodiment, present at the threshold of death, still asking careful questions. And the Megarians had given him the logical instruments that would allow all of this to be stated with precision rather than merely evoked through image and example. Zeno held these four inheritances. He held them the way a craftsman holds materials that have not yet found their form, with patience and with seriousness, turning them in the light to see where they might fit together, where the grain of one might align with the grain of another, where a joint might be made. He was not in a hurry. This is perhaps the most Stoic thing about the founding of Stoicism. It was not accomplished urgently. Zeno spent years studying before he taught anything. He sat with crates long enough to understand not just the positions, but the posture, the way the Cynic commitment expressed itself in the texture of an ordinary day, in the pace of walking, in the quality of attention brought to whatever was in front of you. He returned to the Heraclitean texts and followed the compressed, difficult sentences wherever they led, not satisfied with a paraphrase, but trying to find the experience the language was pointing at. He sat in the Megarian school and worked through arguments until the formal structure of inference became second nature, until he could feel the difference between a valid and an invalid move without needing to think slowly through each step. Patience is itself a philosophical position, the willingness to not arrive at the conclusion before the thinking is finished, to let the ideas remain incomplete rather than forcing a premature synthesis, reflects at the level of intellectual practice, exactly the virtue that Stoic ethics would later articulate as central to the good life. You do not control when understanding comes. You control the quality of attention you bring to the work of finding it. The rest is not up to you, and knowing this clearly and acting from it consistently is a substantial portion of what wisdom is. By the time Zeno began to teach under the columns of the Stoa Poikile, he was not a young man accumulating influences. He was someone who had spent long years bringing separate currents into alignment, and who was now able to speak from a place where they had found, if not absolute harmony, then at least the kind of coherence in which each part explains and supports the others. The Cynic inheritance explained why material goods are not the unconditional good. The Heraclitean inheritance explained the cosmological ground of virtue. The Socratic inheritance provided the human face of the teaching, the demonstration that it was not merely arguable but livable. And the Megarian inheritance provided the logical structure that allowed the whole system to be built and tested and refined over time. This was not a simple thing to have assembled. Philosophy's history is full of people who read widely and absorbed influences from multiple directions and produced, as a result, something eclectic and unstable, a collection of borrowed ideas that never quite cohered into a unified position, that fell apart under pressure at the joints between traditions. What Zeno produced did not fall apart. It was tested heavily over 2,500 years by circumstances that Zeno could not have anticipated, and under conditions of difficulty that tested every claim he had made. And what the tradition discovered through all of that testing was that the synthesis held. There is something worth sitting with quietly in that. The four threads Zeno gathered from the Cynic teacher who walked unhurried through the marketplace, from the philosopher of Ephesus who saw rational law in the movement of rivers, from the example of a man who went to his death still reasoning carefully, from the Megarian scholars who built logic into something precise and teachable, were not four separate answers to four separate questions. They were four angles of approach to a single question. What does it mean to live well in a world that is not fully under your control? The Cynic answer was, divest yourself of everything that can be taken, and what remains is sufficient. The Heraclitean answer was, the world has a rational structure, and the human who understands this is not at war with existence, but in accord with it. The Socratic answer was, act from your deepest understanding of the good, and no external event can touch what is most truly yours. The Megarian answer was, build your thinking carefully. Attend to the form of your reasoning. Do not let the desire to arrive at a conclusion corrupt the quality of the argument that should carry you there. Zeno listened to all four. He heard, beneath them, something that they shared, but that none of them, speaking alone, had said completely. He spent decades in the patient work of articulating what that shared thing was. When he finally walked out onto the porch of the Stoa Poikila and began to teach, what he offered was not a fifth tradition alongside the others. It was the account of what they had all been reaching for from different directions, and had each partially found. Wisdom, on this account, is not a single discovery. It is not the result of a single insight, arriving at a particular moment with the force of revelation. It is the patient work of sitting with different kinds of knowing until you can feel how they belong together, not forcing the fit, not papering over the real differences, but following each tradition far enough down into its own roots that you begin to find the place where the root systems of different trees in the dark underground have grown toward the same deep water. Zeno found that water. It took him a long time. He was not in a hurry. The porch where he eventually taught was open on one side, sheltered by columns, with the life of the city moving past in full view, and the form of the teaching, like the form of the architecture, held something of the same quality as the gathering that had preceded it. Present to all of it, protected by nothing except the clarity of the understanding he had spent years arriving at, neither enclosed from the world nor swept away by it, simply there in the open shade, speaking carefully about what he had found. Outside the school of Stilpo, on some ordinary afternoon in the long middle of his formation, Zeno might have paused and felt all four traditions present in his thinking simultaneously: the cynic simplicity that distrusted ornamentation, the Heraclitean patience with paradox and flux, the Socratic commitment to honest question over comfortable answer, the Megarian precision that would not allow a loose argument to stand uncorrected, and noticed, perhaps for the first time without anxiety, that they were not contradicting each other. They were describing the same thing from different altitudes. The thing they were describing was not yet named. The naming would come later, in the slow unfolding of years of public teaching on the porch of the painted Stoa. What it named was this: that the life organized around what is genuinely within reach, the quality of attention, the integrity of choice, the willingness to reason clearly about what is real and what is imagined, is a life that holds, not a life free from difficulty, not a life immune to loss or illness or the ordinary disappointments that the world distributes without prejudice, but a life with a center that does not shift when the surrounding circumstances shift. A life whose ground is not the ground beneath the feet, but something deeper and quieter and far less contingent. Crates had shown him this was possible. Heraclitus had suggested why. Socrates had demonstrated it under the most extreme conditions available, and the Megarians had given him the tools to build the argument carefully enough that it could be examined and tested, and still, at the end of the examination, stand. Zeno, late in his years of study, holding these four inherited threads in the mind at once, and beginning to feel where they belonged together, was perhaps not thinking about founding anything. He was thinking about the question. He had always been thinking about the question. What the gathering had done, all those years of patient attention to different traditions, different temperaments, different angles of approach, was not give him an answer. It had given him a ground steady enough to stand on while continuing to ask. Wisdom, understood this way, is rarely accomplished urgently. It tends to arrive like the recognition of a thread that was always present in the weave, not new, not inserted from outside, but visible now in a way it was not visible before, because the looking has become patient enough and clear enough to see what was already there, running through everything, holding the whole quietly together. Cleanthes arrived at the Stoa Poikiel before the light had fully settled over the agora. The square was not yet busy. A few merchants were moving toward their positions. A water carrier crossed the open stones. Pigeons gathered and separated near the eastern entrance, and the painted porch on the northern edge stood quiet, its columns holding the early shadow in long regular lines across the floor. Cleans had been a student here for 19 years. He had listened from that edge, stood at that column, walked this floor more times than any man then living had walked it. He stopped at the entrance to the porch, the way a person stops at the threshold of a room where something has changed, and stood there for a moment without speaking. Then he walked to the place where Zeno had usually stood, turned to face the open square, and waited for the students who would come. They came, not many, and not at first with any certainty about whether they should sit or stand, whether the morning should be marked in some way before the teaching resumed. Cleans resolved their uncertainty, the only way available to him. He began to speak. His voice was not Zeno's voice. His hands did not move the way Zeno's hands had moved. But the argument he began was the same argument that had been made in this porch for decades, and after a few sentences the students settled, and the porch returned to what it had been, which was a place where the thinking continued. This is not a small thing. Most of what philosophers begin does not outlast them by a single generation. The system closes with the thinker's death. The students scatter toward their own diverging interests. The particular way of framing the questions dissolves back into the larger conversation of the city and the age. What Zeno had built on this porch was different, not because he had arranged for its continuation, though he had chosen Cleanthes with care. It was different because the ideas themselves had proven to be the kind that people needed to return to, that answered something genuine in the experience of being alive and having to decide how to live, that could be taught by one mind to another and held by that other mind without distortion or loss. Cleanthes was not a man who had come to philosophy easily. Ancient accounts describe him as a former boxer, a man who had worked as a water carrier at night to support his studies during the day, who had been mocked by some for the slowness with which he moved through an argument. But the slowness was not absence of understanding. It was something else, something closer to thoroughness, the kind of mind that will not move forward until what has already been said has been fully absorbed. He stayed at the Stoa for 32 years after Zeno's death, 32 years of walking the same porch, of returning each morning to the same set of questions, of transmitting to successive groups of listeners the same core distinctions. That kind of sustained attention is itself a form of philosophical practice. It is not separate from the thinking. It is the thinking made visible in a life. The asterisk hymn to Zeus, asterisk that Cleanthes composed during those years, is the longest surviving work from the early Stoic school. It is a philosophical poem as much as a religious one, and what it describes is not a god in the conventional sense, but the logos, the rational principle that the Stoics understood to be present in everything, holding the apparent disorder of events inside an order that remains visible to the mind, that has trained itself to perceive it. The hymn addresses this principle directly, which is unusual for a philosophical text, and the directness is not rhetorical ornament. It reflects something Cleanthes genuinely believed, that the reason pervading existence is not an abstraction to be argued about, but a living presence to be addressed, the way one addresses something that is actually there. He had learned this from Zeno. He had spent 32 years deepening it. What he passed on to Chrysippus was not what he had received unaltered, but what he had held long enough to understand from the inside. Chrysippus came to the porch with a different kind of mind. Where Clinthus was slow and thorough, Chrysippus was fast and structural, a builder of arguments in the way that an architect is a builder of load-bearing forms. Ancient sources credit him with over 700 works. Almost none of them survive intact, only fragments preserved in quotation by later writers who disagreed with him, which is its own form of philosophical longevity. What those fragments reveal is a mind engaged in the work of making precise what Zeno had sketched, of carrying each major Stoic claim to its logical conclusions, testing it against objections, reinforcing it with formal argument, and fitting it into its proper position within the larger system. Without Chrysippus, ancient writers observed, there would have been no Stoa. They said this alongside the observation that without Zeno, there would have been no Chrysippus, which is not a contradiction. It is an account of how a tradition actually works, the founding vision requiring the systematic elaboration, and the systematic elaboration requiring the founding vision, neither one sufficient without the other. What Chrysippus built was what later ages would encounter when they turned toward Stoicism, seeking not just inspiration, but architecture, not just the gesture of the master's hand dividing the air, but the full account of why that gesture made sense, what cosmology it rested on, what theory of knowledge it assumed, what conclusions about the good life it genuinely required. He wrote on logic with a precision that modern scholars have recognized as an early form of propositional reasoning, the analysis of conditional statements in forms that would not be fully rediscovered in the West until centuries later. He wrote on physics, on the logos, on the soul. He wrote on ethics with a comprehensiveness that left his successors the task not of adding to the structure, but of deciding how to inhabit it. The porch that Zeno had opened in the agora had become, through Cleantus and Chrysippus, something that could travel, that could be carried in texts across distances that a physical porch cannot cross. And it traveled. This is the part of the story that tends to surprise people who think of ancient philosophy as something that stayed in Athens, that belonged to the agora, that required the specific light and noise and gathering of that particular place. The Stoic school moved. Its students came from Tarsus, from Soli, from Alexandria, from cities throughout the eastern Mediterranean, and they took what they had learned back with them, and the arguments continued in new locations, in new languages, under new political conditions, with new problems pressing on them from outside. By the time Rome had become the dominant political force in the Mediterranean world, Stoicism had already begun to find in the Roman character something it could inhabit without being deformed. The Roman emphasis on duty, on the subordination of private feeling to public obligation, on the courage required to do what must be done without complaint, found in Stoic ethics not a foreign imposition, but a philosophical articulation of something it already understood in practice. Cicero translated Stoic ideas into Latin. Epictetus, born a slave, taught them in a schoolroom in Nicopolis to students who traveled from across the empire to hear him. The road from the slave quarters to the philosophical school is not a short one, and Epictetus had walked it entirely, which gave his account of Stoic practice a weight that the arguments alone could not produce. He had not read about the distinction between what is within our power and what is not. He had lived it in conditions where the distinction was not philosophical but material, where the body was legally owned by another person, and only the interior life, the faculty of assent, the capacity to judge and to value, remained genuinely one's own. What he taught from that position was not resentment, but something harder and more durable, a precise account of where freedom actually lives and why it cannot be taken by any external force, including the force of legal ownership, because it does not reside in any place that ownership can reach. His students wrote down what he said. The asterisk discourses. Asterisk and the small handbook known as the Asterisk Enchiridion. Asterisk are not texts. Epictetus composed, but transcriptions made by his student, Arion, and what they preserve is not the polished argument of a writer at a desk, but the live texture of a teacher in a room, pressing his students, returning to the same points when they have not been absorbed, refusing to let the distinction between what is up to us and what is not dissolve into comfortable agreement that everyone already understands it. Almost no one already understands it. Epictetus knew this from long experience. The understanding that the instruction points toward is not the conceptual grasp of the distinction, which comes quickly, but the lived embodiment of it, which takes a long time and involves many returns to the beginning. He sent his students back to the beginning regularly. The porch had become a schoolroom, and the schoolroom was doing the same work the porch had done. Marcus Aurelius had never attended the school at Nicopolis. He had read Epictetus, and the reading had changed him in the way that certain books change people who are ready for them, not by introducing a new framework, but by naming something that was already being struggled toward, giving it a precision and a depth that the struggle alone had not produced. He was the most powerful person in the Roman world at the time, and he was also, by his own private account, a person who found the requirements of that position genuinely difficult, who lost his patience in ways he wished he had not, who returned the next morning to the same faults, who needed to be reminded constantly of what he already knew. The private journal he kept for this purpose, written in Greek rather than Latin, addressed to no reader, intended for no publication, is one of the most unusual documents to survive from the ancient world. It is a philosopher talking to himself, in the dark, about what he cannot seem to stop getting wrong. He wrote it, most scholars believe, during military campaigns in the last years of his reign, in conditions of physical hardship and political complexity that were far from the Athenian agora and the sheltered porch. The empire he governed was under pressure from multiple directions. People around him died, including several of his children. The work of administration required him to spend significant portions of his time making decisions whose consequences he could not fully foresee, operating in the domain the Stoics called things not up to us, where the outcome of effort is genuinely uncertain, and the only reliable foothold is the quality of the intention behind the effort. He returned to this point in the asterisk Meditations asterisk so many times that the returns become visible as a rhythm, the same truth being taken up again and again, not because it has been forgotten, but because remembering it once is never enough. The practice requires the return. The return is the practice. What he wrote in that journal reaches across the centuries with an immediacy that is different from what most philosophical texts produce, because it was never adjusted for an audience, never polished to persuade, never arranged to demonstrate the competence of the author. It is a man telling himself in Greek, by lamplight in a military tent, to be patient with difficult people, to remember that his own faults are not different in kind from the faults that irritate him in others, to notice when he is being moved by the desire for praise, and to return from that movement to the only work that genuinely matters, to do the next thing that can be done, to do it well, to release the outcome. The Stoic tradition had traveled then from a public porch in the Athenian agora to the private journal of a Roman emperor, from an open colonnaded space where anyone passing through the marketplace might pause and listen to a sealed notebook never intended for any eyes but those of the person writing. This is not a narrowing, it is an expansion in a different direction. Zeno's philosophy had begun in a public place because wisdom, on his account, had no rational basis for exclusion, no principled reason to be withheld from anyone willing to stand in the shade and listen. Marcus Aurelius was practicing that same wisdom in the most private space a mind can occupy, the conversation it has with itself, in the hours when there is no audience, no performance, no requirement to appear adequate, that the tradition had become both a public teaching and a private practice, both a formal school with named heads, and an interior discipline conducted entirely without witnesses, is not a contradiction in the development of Stoicism, but its fullest expression. The Logos on the Stoic account pervades everything. Philosophy practiced in the agora and philosophy practiced in the dark were not separate activities. There is a question that arises, sometimes in proximity to a tradition this old. Not a hostile question, simply a genuine one. What does it mean to hold these ideas now, in a time and a world that is not Athens, not Rome, not any of the historical moments in which Stoic practice was first articulated and tested? The answer the tradition itself tends to return is that the question has always been present in every generation and has always been resolved the same way, not by establishing historical continuity as a credential, but by returning to the central distinctions and asking whether they still hold, whether the line between what is genuinely within the reach of the rational will and what is not remains where Zeno drew it, whether virtue, the quality of how one acts and judges rather than the outcomes one achieves, remains the thing that cannot be taken by any change in external circumstance. These questions have been asked by people living in conditions that differed from one another, as completely as conditions can differ. They were asked by free citizens of Athens and by an enslaved philosopher in Nicopolis. They were asked by senators and soldiers and students and the private person sitting alone with a book in a time and place that Zeno could not have imagined. And the answer has tended, across these very different conditions, to be that the distinctions hold, that the line remains where it was drawn, that the quality of a person's inner life, the care and honesty and steadiness with which the faculty of judgment is exercised, does not depend on historical circumstances for its validity. This is not a comfortable conclusion in one sense because it removes the permission to defer the practice until conditions are more favorable. But it is, in another sense, the most generous thing a philosophical tradition can offer, the assurance that the essential work is always available, regardless of what else is or is not. Contemporary psychology arrived at a portion of this territory by a different route. The therapeutic approach that researchers now call cognitive behavioral therapy rests at its structural center on an observation that Zeno and his students would have recognized immediately, that what produces distress is not primarily the event itself, but the interpretation placed upon the event, the judgment ratified by the faculty of assent. The interval between what arrives and what is believed about what arrives is where the practice lives. Therapists working in this tradition teach their patients to identify automatic interpretations, to hold them at a slight distance, to ask whether the thought that has arrived is something they are choosing to ratify or something that has simply appeared and been taken as given. Zeno called this interval *synkatathesis*, the moment of assent. He taught it at the Stoa Poikial as the central act of philosophical practice. that this practice would be rediscovered 2.5 millennia later through the observation of clinical outcomes without reference to the Stoa is not a coincidence that requires elaborate explanation. The mechanism it addresses is the human one, available in Athens and available now, unchanged in its basic form by the passage of time. The Stoic school, as a formal institution, did not survive indefinitely. The Porch itself fell into disuse as a philosophical center, was damaged, modified, and eventually demolished, its stones becoming part of later construction, its precise location uncertain, until archaeological work by the American School of Classical Studies began to recover it in the middle of the 20th century. The texts were dispersed, lost, and partially recovered through quotation in later authors who preserved fragments of Chrysippus and others while preserving also their own disagreements with them. Zeno's own writings are almost entirely gone. What he thought in the full precision of his own articulation is known only through the accounts of others, some sympathetic and some not, all working at a remove of at least one generation from the original teaching. This is a significant loss in one sense. The founding voice of the tradition is not directly available. What can be reconstructed is the account of witnesses, the summaries of students, the critiques of opponents, the fragments preserved because they were worth arguing with. But there is another way to understand what survived, which is that the Stoic tradition had always rested less on texts than on practice, less on the preservation of original formulations than on the transmission of a way of attending to the boundary between what is within reach and what is not. This way of attending does not require Zeno's original manuscripts in order to be practiced. It requires only the willingness to locate that boundary honestly, to return to it when it has been forgotten, and to do the work of rational self-examination that Zeno was doing when he walked the length of the porch, back and forth, speaking as he moved. The ground beneath the agora holds more than it is usually given credit for. Centuries of building and rebuilding, of civic renovation and expansion, and neglect and re-excavation have compressed the soil of that place into layers in which different periods of Athenian life are legible to the trained eye as strata of different color and composition. The American archaeologists who began work on the agora in the 1930s found, beneath the Byzantine and Roman layers, the foundations and floor levels of the classical city, including the area on the northern edge where the Stoa Poikile had stood. The compressed earth retained the outlines of the column bases. The worn stone of the floor was still there, worn in the particular way that stone wears when many feet have crossed it in the same direction over a long period of time. No inscription marks this now as the place where something began. The site is part of an archaeological zone, visited by people who may or may not know what the porch was, who may pause to read a label, or may simply walk past, moving through the recovered space of the ancient city, without particular attention to what was said there. The absence of a monument is appropriate. Zeno taught in a public porch, open along one side, because the teaching was not meant to be enclosed. The absence of walls was the point. What could be learned there was not a secret, not a restricted knowledge available only to the initiated, not something that required a membership, or a credential, or a specific social position to receive. It was, on Zeno's account, something available to anyone who would stand still long enough to hear it, and honest enough to follow where it led. What it led toward was not a conclusion, it led toward a practice. The distinction matters. A conclusion can be arrived at and then held as a possession, something known that does not need to be relearned. A practice is different. Unwind trinquasse pair. Writing to Plasub, quasuble your pankering Vesperius o Fraum, how haben Kitov the Fraumlein in plan for posset plein. A practice is something that must be returned to each morning, taken up again each time the previous day's returning has worn off, which it always does, which is not a failure of the practice, but its nature. The Stoic discipline of examining impressions, of pausing at the threshold of assent, of asking which domain the present difficulty belongs to, is not something that is completed once and then available effortlessly. Cleanthes returned to it every morning for 32 years. Marcus Aurelius returned to it in a military tent in the dark, writing to himself by lamplight about the same faults he had written about the previous year. The return is not evidence that the practice has failed. It is evidence that the practice has been understood. That quality of return, of the same work taken up again without shame or impatience, is perhaps the deepest thing the tradition transmits. Not a technique that once mastered requires no further attention. Not a conclusion that once reached resolves the difficulty permanently. Something more like a direction, a way of orienting, to which the practitioner returns each time the orientation has been lost, which it will be, regularly, for as long as the practice continues. The Logos, on the Stoic account, does not require its participants to be perfect. It requires them to be earnest, to continue, to bring the rational will back to its proper position when it has wandered. The wandering is expected. The return is the practice. What Zeno carried from the bookseller's shop to the Stoa Poikiel, to the centuries that followed, was not a finished philosophy, but a complete one, complete in the sense that it addressed, within a single coherent account, the nature of the cosmos, the structure of knowledge, and the question of how to live. Each of the three parts grounded the other two. The ethics rested on the physics, because what it meant to live in accordance with nature depended on knowing what nature was. The physics rested on logic, because the account of a rational cosmos required a coherent account of rational inference. The logic grounded the ethics because the discipline of careful assent was not merely a cognitive technique, but a cosmological participation, the individual rational mind aligning itself with the logos that structured everything. Pull on any thread, and the whole structure comes with it. That integration was Zeno's central achievement, and it was what made the tradition portable, what allowed it to travel from the agora to Nicopolis to a military tent in the Roman Empire to a therapy room in the 20th century without losing its essential form. The night continues to move, as nights do, in the slow way that cannot be hurried and does not need to be. The porch in Athens no longer stands. The columns are gone. The painted panels with their marathon soldiers are lost. The worn stone floor is beneath later construction and protective coverings. What remains of the place is the outline in the earth, the compressed record of what was built and used, and eventually given back to the ground. In that outline, taken as the kind of evidence it actually is, which is the patient evidence of what has persisted, rather than the dramatic evidence of what has survived intact, there is something worth resting beside for a moment. The shape of the porch is still there.